I'm taking you back to the game between Vladimir Kramnik and Garry Kasparov in 1994. It's a legendary game. d4, knight to f6, c4, g6, knight to c3, bishop to g7, e4, b6, knight to f3, kingside castling. Garry Kasparov's King's Indian defense, which he has successfully used for many years. While Kramnik continues the game with bishop to e2, we see the e5 move from Kasparov. Of course, this isn't a pawn sacrifice, because if the whites had made moves like d takes e5, d takes e5, queen takes d8, and after the rook takes d8, the knight takes the pawn with e5, the blacks would have fought back by knight takes e4, reclaiming the pawn they had given. Let's get back to the game. Vladimir Kramnik's choice for the e5 move was d5. Petrosian variant. On this continuation, the whites' main ideas are to keep the game closed because the king is still in the center, and they have also blocked the knight c6 and knight c7 maneuver, which is a standard part of the blacks' King's Indian defense, in which they move their knight to the king's side to attack. Seeing this, Garry Kasparov set a new course for his knight and continued with the a5 move. The blacks will soon want to move their knight to c5 so that they can put pressure on the opponent's center. The goal of the a5 move is to prevent b4 from disturbing the knight when it reaches c5. Vladimir Kramnik is now playing with the bishop to c5, h6, bishop to h4, and as expected from Kasparov, knight to a6. Now Kramnik has continued to play with kingside castling, bishop to d7, and knight to d2. Rightly so, Vladimir Kramnik thinks the e4 pawn needs support. f3 or f4 ideas, on the other hand, may emerge at a convenient time in the future. Now Garry Kasparov continues to play with c5, while Vladimir Kramnik's move is b3. Here's how we can explain what white's goal is. In King's Indian defense, black attacks from the king side, while white attacks from the queen side. Of course, black's knight in c5 appears to be perfect here, but if the whites could disturb this knight with their pawns with tempo, the plan to advance from the queen side, which already had a master plan, would have gained momentum. However, if the whites had made a move with a6 right away, their goal would have been to play b4, of course, and the blacks would have responded with an a4 move, effectively stopping their opponent's game from the queen side. That's why the white chose the b3 move here. Of course, the idea is to play a3 and b4. However, Garry Kasparov does not overlook such a minor advantage, which is amazing. He's making one of the most incredible sacrifices in chess history. Yes, the theory suggested the queen to e8 move in normal circumstances, which Kasparov had seen many times. Of course, the point of this move is to get the pinned queen. Garry Kasparov, on the other hand, has continued and is clearly sacrificing his queen with the knight takes e4 move. Now the bishop takes d8, the knight takes c3, both the bishop and the queen are under request, so the queen to e1, and now rook f takes d8. Looks like the blacks didn't get what they wanted against the queen they lost, as material. Because when we looked at it, they won a knight, a bishop, and a pawn against the queen. But that isn't exactly what the position indicates. To begin with, the blacks have completed their development and all of their pieces are in perfect harmony and activity. We can feel the weight of especially light pieces, and blacks have the advantage of a pair of bishops. Of course, if we look at the e5 pawn, we can add the field advantage to that. But it won't be possible for whites to say the same in the short term. The white pieces are again positioned in a cramped position due to the mismatch between the pieces. Here, Vladimir Kramnik. Of course, there was a lot of analysis on this game at the time because the sacrifice of the queen was something new, and it was suggested that the best move for whites was knight to b1. Kramnik, on the other hand, must not have wanted to waste any time, as he prefers rook to c1. His plan was to have another pawn ready to sacrifice, in the sense of moving away from or pushing this disturbing knight. Let's see. The knight takes a2, the rook to a1, and now the knight to b4. Yes, even though the whites couldn't get rid of this knight, they pushed it back a little bit. However, there is a price to be paid, and that is the second pawn. And now, of course, the threat of black is to play knight to c2. That's why Kramnik moved the bishop to d1, and now Kasparov is moving the e4. With the rook to b1 move, Kramnik counters the threat to his rook, whereas Kasparov chooses the rook to e8 move. Of course, the protection of this e4 pawn is critical because it supports the outpost point, which is critical for knights. Now the rook is against e8. Queen to e3, f5, and h4 from Kramnik. Of course, Kramnik rightly wants to stop Kasparov's ideas like the g5 and f4. The idea of passing his opponent from the king side like a cylinder of his own. Therefore, h4 is understandable. Rook to f8 and g3. Yes, once again, the f4 threat has been fended off, but the whites have also advanced many pawns from the king side, and that means the king side is weakening. Now Kasparov is activating his pieces with rook a to e8, while Kramnik played the king to g2 and knight b to d3. Yes, the black's position is flowing, and the knight in d3 dominates the board. Kramnik's king to g1 move demonstrates how hard the white's position is and how difficult it is to come up with a constructive plan. Whites are waiting, rook to g1. Garry Kasparov now believes it is time to attack, because all of his pieces are in sync. So he made the f4 move. G takes f4, rook takes f4 and h5. Of course, Kramnik knows his position is bad and he's trying to mix up the game. If Kasparov had chosen to, he could have taken the f2 pawn, which would have been a win for black. Kramnik, on the other hand, may prefer to take a more relaxed approach with a little piece exchange by playing the queen against it. For this reason, Kasparov does not want his opponent to relax by exchanging pieces and continues the game with g5. Guys, please remember at the end of the game, this g-pawn will deal a death blow. Now after the g5 move, Vladimir Kramnik continues to wait with rook to f1, while Kasparov has played rook to h4. Of course, bishop h3 is a significant threat. Now the rook to h1 from Kramnik, rook to f4 again, rook to f1, and rook e to f8. Yes, Garry Kasparov has doubled the rooks in the f vertical layout as well. The pressure is getting to be too much to handle. This position in front of us, I believe, may clearly indicate the current state of the game. Take a look at the black pieces. All the pieces are very active and they all really have a function. Almost none of the white pieces, on the other hand, appear to be active. The rook is unable to play anywhere, and the other rook appears to be merely defending. Then again, we see the knights and bishops cannot move much, so is the queen. It's a very difficult situation to be in. And that's why Kramnik turned to the e4 pawn to gain some space, to avoid space congestion, and play the f3 move. Let's see. Now the rook takes h4, f takes e4. Of course, in this attack, a pawn is no longer valuable in Kasparov's eyes. While the knight continues to play with the f4 move, king to g1, knight c to d3, and the other knight gradually approaches, and Kramnik tried to ease his position here by sacrificing a pawn again with e5, but it was ineffective. Knight takes e5 against rook to c1, now rook to h3 and knight to f3. Yes, Kramnik had an idea when he plays f3, because the knight takes e5 against g4, rook takes e3, and knight takes d7. He's attempting to relax by exchanging pieces. But the blacks are 2 pawns ahead and continue to attack. And now the knight to h3, king to g2, rook takes f1, king takes f1, and Kramnik played g2 against g3. But kings are the worst pieces to use in blocks. As a result, the knight has moved to f4, and Vladimir Kramnik has withdrawn from the game. Of course, if the king goes to the wrong location, the rook on e1 is mate. If the king had moved to f1, g2, and the king to f2, the blacks would have won with the rook to e1, because the queen will move up next, and there's nothing the whites can do. That's why Kramnik left the game with knight to f4. We've seen one of Kasparov's legendary games, King's Indian Defense. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to this channel, and click on the bell icon to stay updated with my new videos. Hope to see you in the next videos. Take care.